Welcome to Walking in the Footsteps of Faith, Season 2, Episode 6, The Gospel Comes to Corinth. In Acts chapter 18, we read that Paul leaves the city of Athens and travels about 55 miles along the Saronic Gulf to the city of Corinth, located here in modern-day Greece. One thing we need to understand about Corinth is that it is situated on a land bridge. To the southeast is the Saronic Gulf and the Aegean Sea, and to the northwest is the Corinthian Gulf and the Ionian Sea. Now this introduces a very practical problem. If you are a sailor, how can you get your goods from one port to the other without having to sail around all the Peloponnesian islands? Well, today that problem has largely been solved. In 1892, the Corinth Canal was finished, and it bridged the gap between the Saronic Gulf and the Corinthian Gulf, and that allows ships to pass from one end to the other. You can see how impressive this canal really is. But what about in Paul's day? If you were a sailor in Paul's time, how would you cross this land bridge?
So I am standing here next to the Corinth Canal. The Corinth Canal was first conceived of back in the time of Nero. Nero actually started digging the Corinth Canal, but when he returned to Rome, he was assassinated, and that was the end of the project. And for many, many hundreds of years, people had ideas of how to dig a canal that would connect the Saronic Gulf to the Gulf of Corinth. Because without that waterway, then the ships would have to travel an extra 141 kilometers or so, about an extra 100 miles or so, through very dangerous and treacherous waters. And so that was never a very desired way to transport goods from one port to the next. So there was always this idea about digging this canal, but that didn't get finished until the late 19th century. Before that, what the ships would do is they would come into harbor here on one side, they would offload their goods, and then you can see right behind me is a road, and this road would actually go all the way from one end of the Gulf all the way through to the other. And so ships would offload their cargo, and they would put their cargo on wagons or carts or other things, and it would be hauled from one port to the next. And then the ship, without the cargo, could be sailed around and would pick up the cargo at the other side. And that allowed for relative safety of transport. What that meant for the city of Corinth is that when the sailors would come here, they would spend 3 days in the city while their goods were being slowly transported across the Gulf. What that led to was a lot of immorality. You had a lot of sailors coming in, and they would go up to the temple of Aphrodite. They would be looking for prostitutes, they would be drinking, they would be living the wild life for the several days that they were here in town. And so that gave shape to the city of Corinth. It also meant that you had people coming from all around the world, and that meant that Corinth was a very cosmopolitan city. It was a very modern place with people from all different backgrounds and different religions that would all congregate here in Corinth. And this road here behind me is sort of a testimony to that quality, that characteristic of life in Corinth when Paul was ministering here. I'm standing near the main road, or on the main road that leads into the city of Corinth. You are seeing exactly what Paul likely would have seen when he traveled here on his second missionary journey. Paul comes to Corinth with a lot of concern weighing heavy on his heart and on his mind. He's left the city of Thessaloniki. He had to leave that church very suddenly. He's very concerned for the believers there. He goes to Athens. He spends some time in Athens speaking to the philosophers and the thinkers of the day. But then essentially he's pushed out of town. The people don't really receive his message very well, and so Paul leaves Athens and he travels about 45 miles or so to the city of Corinth. What you are seeing is downtown, what would have been downtown Corinth, the agora, the marketplace, where people came to discuss ideas and philosophies and so on. There are, to my right, To your left, you will see what were the Roman baths of the time, which were not just a place for relaxing but socializing as well. You would have seen where Paul opened his shop to be a tent maker. Corinth was a city that was founded. It was hundreds of years before the time of Paul, but then it had been completely destroyed by in the year 146. But then in the year 46, the city was rebuilt by Julius Caesar, and it was an impressive place. It was a major center that was even, it was, by the time Paul comes to it, it's more impressive even than Athens. Athens' glory days were behind it. Corinth's glory days were ahead of it. And so this would have been a major commercial center, religious center, philosophical center. And Paul spends about a year and a half here before he's essentially kicked out of town. I want to take you through and show you a little bit of the city, and we're going to visit the place where Paul is actually, in a sense, put on trial, and where things go very badly for him and force him to leave the city.
Welcome to downtown Corinth. After walking along the Lechian Way, which is that main road that travels into the heart of the city, you arrive here, the downtown area of Corinth. All that's left today, obviously, are the ruins, but in Paul's day, all of these would have been businesses, they would have been shops, they would have perhaps been homes where people lived. Corinth was a large city. It had a large population of Roman soldiers as well as sailors. And nearby the city of Corinth was the site of the Isthmian Games. And that all factors in, because what do soldiers need? What do athletes need? They need tents. And so Paul begins working with Priscilla and Aquila, who lived in Corinth and worked as tent makers. And it's in one of these shops right here that Paul meets Priscilla and Aquila. Now, a tent maker in those days was not a job that carried with it a lot of prestige. It wasn't a high status job. And so for that reason, Paul was often looked at by others as being somewhat less admirable or less respectable. He didn't carry with him a lot of prestige or admiration. And so that's one of the reasons that Paul sometimes faced suspicion or even criticism from believers. When Paul arrives in Corinth, one of the things that he does is he begins to go to the synagogue. He begins to reason with the Jews and with the Greeks, and he begins trying to show them that Jesus is the Messiah. But this does not go over very well. He's rejected by the Jews.
So I am standing in what was once downtown Corinth. This is what is known as the Agora. We sometimes call it the marketplace, but really what it was a place where people came to discuss ideas. Philosophers and politicians and ordinary people would come to listen and discuss and debate ideas. And then along with that, people would come to sell their goods, their merchandise, whether it be clothing, whether it be maybe jewelry, pottery, or in Paul's case, probably tents. We are standing on top of something in the middle of downtown Corinth, which is known as the Bema. In Acts chapter 18, we read a little bit about Paul's visit to Corinth. Paul comes here, and he's actually here for a year and a half during this visit. And in that time, he's working with Priscilla and Aquila, making tents. And in that time, he's also meeting with Jews in the synagogue, and he's meeting with Gentiles in the marketplace. Many people were converted during that time, but many of the Jewish people who were part of the synagogue did not like the fact that Paul was leading, in their view, they were leading the Jewish people away from proper religion. And so the Jewish people actually arrest Paul, and they drag him right here, or right near here. And they bring him before a man called Gallio, the proconsul. He was sort of a local judge. Gallio hears what the crowds are upset about, and he decides that this is not his issue to be worried about. He responds by saying, if this is a civil matter, I would hear your case, but this is really a religious matter. And so Gallio says, I want nothing to do with this. And he essentially throws him out of his court. Well, that was not good enough for the Jewish people. So what the Jewish people do is they take the leader of the synagogue, a man called Sosthenes, and they beat him right here. And it's at that point that Paul realizes that it's going to be too dangerous for him to remain in Corinth, and then he moves then from there to the port of Centrae, and he sets sail then for Ephesus.
No, I am.
Inscribed on a wall behind me are the words from 2 Corinthians, where it says, this slight and momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. Paul wrote those words to the Corinthian church, and you begin to sense the power of those words, because Paul, in the midst of his ministry to the Corinthians, is suffering. He's threatened. He's fearing for his very life. And yet he understands that in the midst of all of that, God is doing something that will prepare him for a far greater glory. Hey there, I'm standing here in the port of Centrae, which is just outside the city of Corinth. This place is significant in the New Testament for a couple of reasons. This is where Paul sets sail from Corinth and he makes his way to Ephesus. It's also a place where Paul takes a Nazirite vow. He does that as a way of improving his ability to witness to both Jew and to Gentile. And so this place is a place where Paul himself actually was. And you can see all around me, this is a port. This is where the ships would have come in and docked. They would come in about a third of the way in. They would sort of run the ship aground onto the shallow sand, and then they would be able to offload their goods and passengers and so on. And so this is a place you can kind of look and see around me. These are places where the ancient ships would have come in. About 500 or 600 years after the time of Christ, there was a church that was built on this location as a way of commemorating the significance of this spot.
And so Paul departs from this port here in Centrae. He leaves Corinth behind and he makes his way towards Ephesus, where he will continue his second missionary journey. But his work with the Corinthians wasn't finished. This was the first visit that Paul made to Corinth, but we know that he made at least 2 more visits. The second visit he makes was what he called his painful visit. While he was in Ephesus, he learned of some real problems within the Corinthian church. There were divisions among the believers. There was immorality that was taking place. There was conflict. And so Paul returns to this church to address those concerns and those problems. And this was painful for him. It was painful for the church. But it seems that the relationship had been effective, or the visit had been effective, and the problems had been dealt with. And so Paul makes a third visit after these concerns had been alleviated. And this visit is much better. In fact, on this visit, he's taking up a collection from the Corinthians to assist the believers in Jerusalem who had been suffering because of a famine. Well, we are ending our journey with Paul here. Of course, Paul continues to do his work. The second missionary journey continues as Paul traveled to Ephesus and then onward from there. And God's work in the world continued. He continued to use Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke and many others to advance his mission in the ancient world. And of course, his work did not stop in the ancient world. God continues to do his work even today. He continues to bring the good news of hope, the good news of the gospel into small towns, into major cities. He continues to engage people of all cultures and all worldviews, all races, all backgrounds, with the good news that Jesus is the Messiah, the one whom he sent into this world to redeem and to rule his people. That's a work that continues even now in the 21st century. I want to thank you for joining me as we've been walking in the footsteps of faith. I've enjoyed bringing these videos to you, and I trust that they've been beneficial to you. I want to give a special thanks to my son Derek for helping with recording these videos and then with editing them. want to give a special thanks to the church that I serve, Sunny Slope Church in Salem, Oregon, for allowing me the time to produce these videos, giving me a 3-month sabbatical to travel and then to produce the videos. And then finally, a special thanks to the Lilly Foundation for providing the financial grant that made all of this possible. Thanks again for joining me.